Good evening, everyone. My name's Ian Dransfield, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Queen's Medical Research Institute tonight for this Let's Talk About Health public lecture. Just before I introduce our two speakers, just a reminder that, firstly, we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if there is an alarm goes off, if you could follow the directions of the staff to get you out of the building, that would be good. If you have a mobile phone, we'd appreciate it if you could either switch it off or turn it to silent. The lectures are recorded, so you can always go back and revisit this lecture when it's published on the web, but it helps if there's no mobile phone tones during the lecture to put people off. So we have two speakers tonight. Tom Russ, who's a consultant psychiatrist with NHS Lothian, but he's also co-director of the Alzheimer's Scotland Dementia Research Centre at the Edinburgh University. Tom is particularly interested in dementia epidemiology, and you'll hear more about his work in a moment. Our other speaker is Mark Miller, who's a research group leader here at the Queen's Medical Research Institute. He works in the University BHF Centre for Cardiovascular Science, and he's particularly interested in the cardiovascular effects of air pollution. And the talk tonight, so I'll invite Mark up, but the talk tonight is Poor Air Quality, Polluting Hearts and Minds.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, thanks very much, Ian, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming along. It's a pleasure to be able to tell you a little bit about our research today. I could talk about this subject for at least an hour just myself alone. We are locking the doors, so you're not allowed to escape until I've finished. I will speak fast as well. Feel free to interrupt me or tell me to slow down. I will do my best to try and be as quick as possible, though, and I've tried to sort that out in my talk. So let's get straight into it now. So I'm going to tell you about the research we do into air pollution, and our research has shown that air pollution is bad for you. So that's it. I promised I'll be quick. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Now I'm being flippant, of course, but there is a reason to this. I'm trying to make a point here. So none of you need some mumbling scientists at the front to tell you that air pollution is bad for you. You all know that. But actually, I think we might try and change a few of your views today. You might be surprised just how bad air pollution is for you and how much of a problem it is. So it's Tom and I's job to try and get you as worried as we possibly can within this next hour. Now, clearly, air pollution is an important topic because it's never out the headlines now. Not a month goes by when it's not in the national news headlines, and not a day goes by when it's in the online media. And these are just a selection of a few. I'm not expecting you to read them. This is just a selection of a few that I found just from last week as it happened. And actually, it's starting to get a little bit ridiculous now, actually, because the study is appearing saying that air pollution is responsible for everything. You might not be able to see this small writing, but saying that air pollution is responsible for an increase in crime in cities. Air pollution is responsible for making teenagers eat fatty foods. Air pollution has odd effects. It's stopping bees from smelling. And actually, companies are really sort of tapping into our anxieties as well. We're now seeing products to protect you against air pollution. So here's some shampoo and some vitamins, again, supposed to protect you against air pollution. And actually, there are even some rather more unusual things to protect you against air pollution, like this dual-purpose piece of underwear. I think we'll just skip over that quite quickly now. But in all seriousness, this is a lot of fuss, and a lot of fuss is for the reason that we're really just now beginning to understand the scale of the problem of air pollution. But the health effects of air pollution, I'm not trying to kid everyone, that we've known about this for centuries. So let me show you this person here. This dapper chap is John Evelyn, and in 1661, he produced an article called the Fumifugium. I can never say that. I've done well if I got that right today. And he presented this to the king at the time. And insightfully, in this document, he said that the air quality in London was absolutely terrible. But even more insightfully, he said it was responsible for most of the ill health in London. Not only that, he had solutions as well. Remarkably simple: plant more trees and gardens. Or even better, he just moved to Paris. You've got to do that before March the 29th, though, I believe, these days. And when many people think of air pollution in history, they think of images like this. So the Great Smog of London, this was in 1952, and these thick pea supers. This is not fog, this is actually smoke in the air from air pollutants due to the unusual weather conditions at the time. But this is a useful thing to highlight because this really brought to people's attention not just the health effects of air pollution, but that air pollution can kill. So the blue line here is monitoring the number of deaths that were registered during the time, and you can see there's a big spike here over this grey bar here, and that's the period of smog. So air pollution seems to be linked to a large number of deaths from this. And although we don't see these thick pea supers today, air pollution is still a problem, and it's now almost accepted that air pollution kills in some regards. Now, people aren't dropping dead on the street when they breathe in car exhaust, but actually, if you look at where people live, you look at what the levels of air pollution are, and then you look at the hospital admissions in the same areas, you'll see there's a clear link between those two factors. And that's even after you do all these fancy statistics to work out what the other causes of deaths might be. And even in Scotland, which is a fairly clean part of the UK, you can see this is a map that's showing the air pollution deaths, and there's levels of air pollution, so people are dying of air pollution in Scotland. In fact, you can do some crude sort of estimates here, and this was reported by The Independent, saying that more people die of air pollution in Scotland every year than die of road accidents in Scotland every single year. So, in Scotland, it's in about the region of about 2,000 excess deaths every single year. How about the UK as a whole? So this is the quiz time now. So in the UK, how many deaths do you think are due to air pollution every single year or attributed to air pollution? I'll give you three options: 5,000, 10,000, or 30,000. So hands up for A, hands up for B, hands up for C. So it's C. Very clever. What a clever audience. C is the correct answer. And actually, here's the rough estimates. There are some uncertainties in these estimates, but it's around about 30,000 deaths are caused attributed to air pollution every year. I should say this is early deaths as opposed to people just dying suddenly. But I think it's the worldwide figures that are really staggering, and that's worldwide 3 to 7 million people, 3 to 7 million premature deaths are caused by air pollution every single year. I mean, this is absolutely staggering numbers. And I'm going to highlight this even further. I'm going to just show you a little bit of data from a scientific group called the Global Burdens of Disease Group. And they had a really difficult task of trying to find what's the risk factors for all different causes of disease all around the world in different populations. And then they rank them. They rank the top 25. I'll show you the top 10 here. And outdoor air pollution was the 5th highest risk factor for all different causes of disease. And that's above things like low exercise and poor diet that we know are risk factors for many diseases. Why is it having such a problem? Well, one of the reasons is that everybody's exposed to air pollution. In fact, it's been estimated that more than 90% of the world's population are exposed to levels of air pollution that's above the World Health Organization guidelines. Now, you'll see from the map here that air pollution is worse in many developing countries. And that's certainly the case. It's worse than most of developed countries like the UK. But nonetheless, even low levels of air pollution are a worry. And that's because the research suggests that there's no safe levels of air pollution. So even if you live in a relatively clean area, you're still going to see effects of air pollution. Air pollution has effects all over the world. It actually has effects all over the body too. So you probably assume, when you think about air pollution, that air pollution, when you breathe it in, it affects the lungs. It causes things like asthma, lung disease, for example. And that's certainly true. But actually, in the last decades, we're starting to discover it has effects all over the body. So, as you'll hear, it has effects on the brain, it has effects on the liver, the kidney, the gut, it affects our blood cells, it's linked to diabetes, it's linked to a number of different cancers. And we know that exposure during pregnancy has effects on the unborn child as well. You have poorer birth outcomes, and the health of the child later in life is worse. But let me go back to this previous slide once again, and this was the ranking the different risk factors. And what this paper also did, it showed you the number of deaths in millions. Is it millions? It might not be millions, but it's the number of deaths in the column here. And what was interesting about this was it broke the deaths down into different causes. And you can see this was for different years. So for 2015, most of the deaths are caused by this pink and grey colour. And this colour is cardiovascular disease. So people are dying from air pollution due to diseases that affect the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. And there's plenty of evidence for this. This has been known for a number of years now, that both short-term and long-term exposure to air pollution make you more likely to develop heart disease, to have heart attacks, strokes, for example. But there's many questions still remain. So how does air pollution have these effects? What is it in air pollution that has these effects? And when we look at cardiovascular disease and air pollution, what you tend to see when you look at population studies is it's the particles in the air that seem to be particularly harmful. So what is air pollution? And that's not a question I can answer in a few minutes, because it's a real complicated mixture of a number of different chemicals that are around the environment, is affected by the weather, where the air pollution comes from, lots of other variables. But you can break these down into gases, liquids, and particles. So for cardiovascular disease, it's these things, these particles, that seem to be particularly worrying. All these things will affect your health, but it's the particles that are linked to the cardiovascular effects. But particles themselves, they're very mixed. They come from lots of different sources. They're made up of different things, but also, importantly, they're also different sizes as well. And actually, it's the size of particles that's actually used to regulate and to measure air pollution and regulate them in our environment. And you may have heard these measures called PM10 and PM2.5. So PM is particulate matter, and the number 10 is the size of the particle. So PM10 are particles that have less than 10 micrometers in diameter. That's about the fifth of the width of a human hair. And smaller particles still, PM2.5, that's fourfold smaller than this. I'm going to come back to that in a second, but let's just look at PM2.5 now. Actually, and I get asked this quite often, levels of PM2.5 in the UK are fairly low. If you look at the limits, actually according to a lot of the guidelines, we need to be in this region here. So we need to be in these dark blue colours, which you can see most of the UK is above these dark blue colours. These are average levels. So average levels of air pollution are okay, but there are actually breaches in various guidelines in major cities, even cities such as Scotland. In addition to this as well, though, levels of air pollution are improving. So PM2.5 has been falling consistently over the last sort of 60 years. So we don't have a problem, do we? Well, actually, remember I said that we're measuring particles. They're measured by the weight of these particles. So when we have particulate matter in the air, the weight of these particles has fallen in the air recently. But what this measurement doesn't really take into account is at the same time, there's been a massive increase in the number of vehicles on the UK roads, and with that comes this car exhaust. And in that car exhaust is a huge number of what we call traffic-derived nanoparticles. So this is a third category I'm going to add to the list called ultrafine PM or nanoparticles. And these are much further still. So if we look at the different size of it, here's your hair and going down into smaller sizes. Nanoparticles in this region here, they're absolutely tiny. They're about the same size range of viruses. And that's important because it's these particles that we think are worrying. And the reason why they're worrying is these smaller particles, they're the ones that are going to get deep down into your lungs. Not only that as well, but because they're so small, they don't weigh very much. And so when we measure PM10 and PM2.5, we're not detecting these reliably. But yet, despite being so small, they've got this big surface area. So there might not be many of them, but they have a big surface area, and that's what interacts with the body. That's what carries lots of harmful chemicals into the body. And when we talk about nanoparticles in urban environments, as I've said, it's vehicle exhaust, which is a particular problem, especially diesel exhaust, which generates much more of these particles than things like petrol. So what effects does diesel exhaust have? So, excuse me, what effect does diesel exhaust have? Well, there was a rather daring cardiologist called Dave Newby, who worked in the centre at Edinburgh University, and he managed to persuade the British Heart Foundation to give us some funding to actually let us expose people to diesel exhaust particles. And we did this in collaboration with some researchers in the Netherlands and Sweden, and they have these unique exposure chambers. And this almost as bad as it looks. You have an idling diesel engine, and the fumes go into the box, where we have a poor volunteer getting exposed to the exhaust, and we make him psycho, and we make him read one about papers to make him really miserable as well. That's a little bit of an over-exaggeration, because what happens is most of this exhaust is actually carried away, and a tiny amount of it passes into here, and it's mixed with filtered air. And what's good about these is you can set the levels to whatever you want to study, be that a rural environment, a busy city centre, a mega city such as Beijing. And we have the volunteer, and they cycle away for about 2 hours, 1 or 2 hours, and then afterwards we take them to our clinical research facility, and we look at a range of different health markers. I should say this is not the same person here. We asked them to lie down. He is still alive. And I should say he's not aged 40 years in that 2 hours. I'm just going to show you a sample of results. I'm getting dirty looks already because I'm going well over time here. So I'm going to show you some of the results that we're going with 1 hour exposure to diesel exhaust at a high level, but not an unreasonably high level, maybe such as a mega city such as Beijing. And what we did is we looked at blood vessel relaxation. So your blood vessels in your body, they're not just simple tubes, they're an active organ that contract and relax, and they control the blood around your body. And what we do is we use a way of stimulating these blood vessels, and when we stimulate them, the blood vessels relax, they open up, and the blood flow increases. We measured this in the forearm, and this is what you want to see. You want to see the blood vessel relaxing, nice healthy relaxation. So that's the response to someone who's had an hour's exposure to clean air. If they've had an hour's exposure to diesel exhaust, this is what you see. So the vessels can still relax, but they're just not able to have the same relaxation as you would normally do. And this is a really sizable inhibition. This is the sort of thing you'd see between a smoker and a non-smoker. Even more worrying, this effect happened quickly, and we also asked these people to come back the next day. So 24 hours of exposure, and that was still there. So these effects are long-lasting. And we took this a lot further. Well, Professor Newby took this a lot further, and they showed that like a range of short-term exposure to these exhausts has effects throughout the cardiovascular system. It affects the blood, makes it more likely to clot, affects the heart, changes the rhythm, makes the heart more susceptible to damage, and it changes blood vessels. And all these things together are not what you want to have. All these things together are going to make you more likely to develop cardiovascular disease, and if you already have cardiovascular disease, you're more likely to have a heart attack and a stroke. And I'm going to come back just in a second and tell you a little bit more about this now, but I'm going to hand it over to Tom while we're showing a picture of the brain, and he's going to get you a little bit further worried still.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. And I've turned my microphone on, so fingers crossed you can hear me as well. Talking of stroke, or at least to tell you that I'm not going to be talking about stroke, stroke is very clearly related to air pollution as well, in a way that's probably going through a similar route to the cardiovascular effects that you've just heard about. And the World Health Organization are concerned enough to say that about a quarter of strokes could be attributable to air pollution. But that's a very short-term effect. If there's a peak in air pollution, such as was seen in 1952, to an extreme with the smog, even the next day there's a surge in hospital admissions for stroke. I mainly study dementia, and the associations are much slower and much more long-term. So this is a picture of Los Angeles, which is an enormous collection of cities, but one of the major problems that they have is that of air pollution. One of my collaborators there describes it as a city on wheels, which I think is a bit of a poetic way to describe. If any of you have ever been there, it's not quite as poetic as perhaps that might suggest. But there are a number of groups around the world, including here in Edinburgh, who are looking at the links between air pollution and dementia. And the group in Los Angeles are extremely active, more out of self-preservation, I think, than anything else. And in fact, there's a lot of research happening linking air pollution with dementia. The problem is that it's all just really harping on the same theme. All the studies that are being produced are really just looking at the same thing. They look at where people live and estimate what their exposure to air pollution is, and then link that with their risk of dementia. And to my mind, there are three really important questions that we can't answer from the research literature at the moment. So the first is, which type of dementia is most affected by air pollution? And I'll explain a bit about dementia and the different types in a moment. So when, during life, is exposure to air pollution bad or most bad? Is there a time when it's okay and a time when it's really harmful? And finally, we've heard that air pollution is a very complex mix of substances. Which of those substances is the bad one, if you can differentiate between them? So firstly, to think about which type of dementia is most affected, I know many people find the language that we use very confusing. So hopefully to clarify a little bit, dementia is an umbrella term. It really describes a syndrome of progressive cognitive and functional impairment, and that's it. It makes no statement as to the cause of those symptoms. And there are a number of diseases which cause dementia. The most common one is Alzheimer's disease. A close second is probably vascular dementia, which is really the same process that happens elsewhere in the body to cause heart disease, which is happening in the blood vessels of the brain. And I've put mixed dementia in brackets because these categories aren't clean and separate. In reality, many people who are seen and diagnosed with a dementia have a bit of a mixed picture. It may be that it seems there's an element of Alzheimer's disease there, but there may well be some suggestions they have vascular dementia as well. And there are other important but slightly less common dementias, like dementia with Lewy bodies, which is really on a continuum with Parkinson's disease, and frontotemporal dementias, which are an extremely complicated and heterogeneous group, but important nonetheless. And really the answer to my question as to which dementia is most affected is we don't know. The majority of research really looks at dementia as if it were a homogeneous entity without looking at these differences. It may be that actually it's vascular dementia which is most linked to air pollution through similar mechanisms to those we've just been hearing about, or it may be there's a separate effect of air pollution on the neurodegenerative process of Alzheimer's disease, but we don't know. My second question is, when during life is exposure to air pollution most bad? That's not totally good grammar, is it? So I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to ask you, actually, because I've already hinted that this is a question we don't know the answer to. What do you think? We've got three options here. Exposure to air pollution when you're in the womb, exposure to air pollution when you're in childhood, or exposure to air pollution in adulthood. Who thinks in the womb is worst? Who thinks when you're a child? And who thinks when you're an adult? So it's quite split, perhaps arguing for early life. You may all be right. We don't know yet. We certainly know it's bad, but with regards to your brain and dementia, it's an unanswered question. But I'm very interested in a field called life course epidemiology that I'll try to explain to you. And I came to this through study of height. Some of you may recognise this sketch from the Frost Report, I think. Which is a skit on the British social class system. The upper class man on the left looks down on the middle class man who looks down on the lower class man. But height is a very good marker of a number of things that happen to you in early life. Clearly there's some genetic effects on it, but it's also a marker of early life nutrition, psychosocial stress, illness, and socioeconomic status. And we did a study linking height with subsequent risk of dementia. And the shorter you are, the greater your risk of dementia. Now, clearly, height isn't the cause. It's one of these things in early life which influence height, which is probably at work. And it's now acknowledged that dementia is a condition, or the neurodegenerative dementia, so Alzheimer's disease is the one in particular I'm thinking of, develop throughout life. There's not really a period in life when you're not influencing your risk of ultimately developing or not dementia. So at the top, you can see the brain developing and growing. The bad news for all of us except for the high school students here is that your brain starts to shrink from about your mid-30s. So unfortunately, that's an inevitable process. So the one at the end is smaller than the one in the middle. But there are these different periods of life and different risk factors and protective factors are at work which influence your risk. And air pollution I think there's reasonable evidence to conclude is probably one of these. The difficulty in studying air pollution is that if you have a group of people aged 80 or 90, and you know whether some of them have dementia or not, is that we don't have good air pollution data going back to when they were in the womb. Mark showed some data showing particulate matter going back to about the 90s, and that's really where consistent monitoring of air pollution goes back to. Before that, it was more haphazard. So we've been working with some scientists at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to see if we can model what air pollution was probably like, according to our best guess, earlier in life. So this is a map of particulate matter concentrations in Scotland in 1935. And the reason for that year I'll explain in a moment. But the clever people at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology look for the extant records for the year we're interested in, so 1935, then find a more recent year where the meteorology was sufficiently similar for them to assume that there's some comparisons between them, and then use the more recent data along with information on emissions from factories and these sorts of things, population density from historical maps, and they put it all into a clever computer which ultimately churns out this as an estimate. It is just an estimate, but it's the best we've got. The inset is the central belt, so there's no guessing where Glasgow and Edinburgh are in terms of the big conurbations. But this is really the way we need to go if we're going to look at the influence of air pollution in early life on any health outcome. I'm particularly interested in dementia. And the reason for choosing 1935 is that one of the ways we're doing this is using the Lothian birth cohort 1936. Some of you may have heard of this wonderful study. There's only 2 times in the world where the whole population of a country in childhood, in this case age 11, has had their intelligence tested. And it happened twice in Scotland, once in 1932 and once in 1947. And a subsample of about 1,000 of the people tested in 1947 are still being followed up in and around Edinburgh. And I think they're currently being seen for their 5th wave of follow-up. The remarkable, well, one of the many remarkable things about this study is that everybody has given details of their lifetime address history. So we know where they lived throughout their entire life. So if we've got modelled estimates of what air pollution was like when they were born and in subsequent years, as well as knowing where they lived throughout their life, we can get a quite detailed idea of what their exposure to air pollution was throughout their life. And this is a piece of work that we're doing at the moment, funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, to try and link exposure to air pollution throughout the life with ageing and cognition and dementia, to see if we can look at when in life is the most important time. And in this broad field of life course epidemiology, there are 3 models, and we're in the process of exploring which of these might fit best with air pollution and dementia. One is accumulation of risk. So there isn't a time when it's particularly bad or particularly better to be exposed to air pollution. Just the longer you're exposed, the worse it is for you. And that's a possibility. Another is that there might be a sensitive period when it's bad all the time, but there's some periods when it's really bad. It may be that it's always bad to be exposed to air pollution for your brain, but actually when you're a child and your brain is really developing at a fast rate, that's the worst time. Or finally, a critical period is similar, but the critical period is a time when it's bad, and the rest of the time it doesn't really matter whether you're exposed or not. But if you're exposed at that critical period, that's bad for your brain. And we're exploring this. This is work in progress, so I can't answer this question yet, but these are the 3 possibilities. My final question was, which pollutant is most harmful? And you've heard there are a variety of air pollutants. These are some of them. There are others. Sulfur dioxide, particulate matter of various sizes, nitrogen dioxide, nitrogen monoxide, ammonia. And there are complicated links between the levels of each of these, depending on exactly the source, really. To give you an idea of the way research is going, I thought I would look at the articles published on air pollution and dementia last year and see which pollutants they looked at. So the big blue third is various nitric oxides, NO2, NO. The big orange, slightly more than a half, is particulate matter of various sizes, and then there's smaller ones for ozone and sulfur dioxide. Other years, people have looked at carbon monoxide, other pollutants as well, but this is last year. So more than half of the research is really focused on particulate matter, which echoes the attention paid in cardiovascular disease research, really. So just to go back to particulate matter, this is very similar to to what you've heard before about the size of things. So the largest form of particulate matter, PM10, is about a fifth of the size of a human hair, and that comes from dust, pollen, mold, these sorts of things. Then PM2.5, the smaller one, is from combustion particles and organic compounds and metals. And then the tiny, some of you will hopefully be able to see the little white dots, the ultrafine particles, these nanoparticles, which are from smoke and exhaust. And this is a brain. I mean, as psychiatrists, we don't really do a great deal. We're not really thought of the same as other doctors, so we're not considered to know a great deal about anatomy. But I can say with some confidence, this is the brain. I did actually fail my first year anatomy, but I brought it back after that. And there are a number of ways in which air pollution could affect the brain. It may be that there are indirect effects in a similar way to some of the ones that we've heard about for cardiovascular disease. It may be there is inflammation relating to air pollution's effect on the rest of the body, which then affects the brain. Or it may be that effect on the vasculature elsewhere in the body has an effect which affects the brain. Or it may be there's a direct effect of particles, for example, on the brain itself. The dotted red line is for a structure called the blood-brain barrier. So I remember one of my lecturers at medical school who had a wonderful phrase. He said, "Whoever you believe in has got it right." And the blood-brain barrier is really what it says. It's a barrier to stop anything bad from getting into the brain. And so it's generally extremely effective in the things that are circulating around the body that we don't want to go into the brain, including drugs and medications that doctors give you that we don't want to affect the brain, are kept out because of this red dotted line. The bad news is it doesn't seem to work all the time for particles. This is from a paper a few years ago, if you think back to your high school chemistry, there are two types of iron oxides, hematite and magnetite. So these are magnetite particles, these little things in the circles. And the one on the right, the knobbly one, is something that's been observed before in the brain. The knobbliness suggests that it's probably been formed in the body through normal physiological processes. The one on the left in the red circle, which is blown up in the little square with the B, is very smooth. It's the same substance, but it's a different form. And what the authors inferred from the fact that it was so smooth is that actually it required a very high temperature for it to be formed in that way. So their conclusion was that this is a combustion-derived particle that's found actually within the tissue of the brain. So it's suggesting that particles do actually get into the brain, and so may well be having a direct effect on our brains. And on that note, I'll leave it there and hand back over to Mark.
Yeah, I do apologise. You've got to listen to me again as well. But I'm going to try and keep it reasonably quick now. Now, the reason I want to come back to talk to you now is because, one, is a piece of research that we did recently that was reasonably high profile, and also I did it as well, which is unique. I don't often do things in general, and people do that for me and better than me. And the other thing is it brings together the two things we've been talking about, the cardiovascular system and the brain. Okay, let's go past that slide. So, one of the questions you might be asking, and certainly you should be rightly asking, is how does this all happen? How do we have these effects? How does air pollution have these effects all over the body? And I've shown you some of the diagram. It's perhaps easy to see how we go from this step here. Particles in the air, they're breathed in, they go into the lungs. Well, this is the step that we don't really know. Once they're in the lungs, how then do they go into effects on the heart and the brain? And that's something that we've been studying in some detail, and I want to present you just some of the results we've done today. Now, this is called an electron micrograph. Essentially, it's a very thin slice of lung that's been blown up to a high magnification. Okay, so this is lung. The white is like the air spaces of the lung. The grey is the lung tissue. And I've highlighted in on red the blood vessels, the very tiny capillaries that are in there that carry the red blood cells. So these darker ones are red blood cells here. And what I want to draw your attention to here is this region here. There's a very, very, very thin wall here between the air spaces and the blood. And this has to be there so that the gases you breathe into your lung can pass from the lung into the blood and be carried around the body. But I've just mentioned nanoparticles are about the sizes of viruses. Are they small enough? And actually, I've just drawn these on here. The real nanoparticles would be too small to show on this slide, actually. Because they are so small, could they actually directly cross into the blood itself? And once they get into the blood, that's potentially when they can be carried all over the body to have effects all over the body. And this process here, where they cross from the lung into the blood, this is something we call particle translocation. And we tried to investigate this in some detail. Now, it's not something that's particularly easy to research. There's lots of different difficulties. One is that these particles, they're just very, very small. They're very, very small. And also, we admit, there's not that many of them that are going to go from the lung into the blood. So they're very, very low levels in the blood. So actually, we're going to struggle to measure these even in a laboratory. Once they get to the body and they go all the way through the body, there's lots of volume of blood. They can go into organs. And it really does become a bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The last problem I want to say as well is we want to do this for particles in the environment. Yet most of particles from vehicle exhaust, they're made of carbon. So they're made of the element carbon, and that's really difficult to track in the body. So we need ways around this. And the ways that we tackled this is we didn't look at carbon, we looked at gold instead. And why did we look at gold? One of the reasons is you can get gold nanoparticles. So when gold gets to nanoparticle size, it actually goes this purple colour instead. And we can get the size of nanoparticles that are very similar to that of diesel exhaust. So we've got the particle that's the same size as a diesel exhaust particle. The other good reason is that it's safe to use, so we can expose people and animals to these things. And I've been a volunteer to this myself. I'm just standing. So it is safe to use. And probably the most important reason, past my safety, is that we've got lab techniques that can measure very, very low levels of gold in the blood. So we did an experiment that was very similar to our diesel exhaust experiment. But instead of exposure chamber, we asked people to wear a mask, and they breathed in gold nanoparticles from the air into the lungs for 2 hours while exercising. And then after that, we took them to our clinical research facility and we took the blood at certain time points afterwards and just see, can we measure the gold in the blood? This is a little bit of a complicated graph. Essentially, this is the time after exposure. So our exposure to the gold stops here, and then this is the time afterwards. And these are the levels of gold in the blood. Now, it's very difficult to measure. We're close to the limit of detection, but I don't know if you can see that once we finish the gold exposure, gold starts to increase, and it increases over time in the blood. And once we get to a day after exposure, we can measure the gold in the blood of every single volunteer that's breathed in the gold. Perhaps more worrying is we had the opportunity to invite these people back 3 months later. And at 3 months later, we can still measure the gold. And gold is really going to come from our exposure. So it sort of suggests that this gold is not only, these particles are not only going into the lung, but they're staying in the lung and passing into the blood for long periods of time. Now, I hinted at this later on, but we will acknowledge that there's actually very low amounts, very small amounts of particles that are going to cross from your lung into the blood. So why do we care? Why is it important? Well, the reason I think it's important is it depends where they go once they're in the blood. Where does the blood carry them to? And in particular, being cardiovascular science, we want to look at blood vessels in the heart. So we wanted to ask the question is, do these particles, once they get into the blood, do they go to areas of vascular disease? Now, I'm going to show you a schematic of an animal model. So animal models remain essential to medical research at the moment. And of course, this is for the reason that there are things that you just can't do in people. You have to resort to animal models to get to the bottom. And because people aren't willing to give up their major arteries from the heart and things, we have to turn to animals. And we can start to look, for example, as do we see these particles accumulate in the blood vessels themselves? So these animals had gold nanoparticles to the lung. And again, the animals that received the gold, we could start to measure gold in the blood vessels. The interesting thing about this model is that some areas of the vasculature have lots of disease, where other areas don't have much disease. And when we looked at the gold in this area, the levels of gold were much higher in the areas of disease than they were in the areas without disease. So these particles are not only reaching areas of disease, but they actually seem to be preferentially building up in areas of disease. Now, I've just said we can't do this experiments in humans, we can't recreate all these parts, but we can actually, did manage to find a way to show that inhaled nanoparticles do go to areas of disease in man. So you heard the mention of stroke. Well, one of the causes of stroke is that you can have the major artery in the neck, and it becomes blocked with the build-up of vascular disease, so lots of fats and inflammation builds up, and it blocks this blood vessel and it stops the blood flow to the brain. And one of the ways you can treat this, if you have very severe disease, is you can actually have surgery where the neck of the artery, the artery in the neck is opened up, and essentially the piece of disease is removed, and then the vessel's sewn back up and the blood flow is restored. So we actually had the opportunity to recruit a number of these patients who were willing to donate the piece of disease, and this is a picture of it here. This is just a big horrible piece of disease that's come out of the artery of the neck. And a small number of volunteers we recruited were happy to inhale gold nanoparticles the day prior to them having this surgery. And so we took this piece of disease that we took from the people who had received the gold nanoparticles, we took it to a lab and we scanned it. So we scanned in the square region, the grey is just the diseased tissue, under the square region, and this red signal is the signal of gold. So people can inhale gold, and these tiny particles in the air that we breathe get into our blood, and they travel to the areas of disease. And I think that's important because this is gold, it's not doing any harm to people, but if a diesel exhaust particle behaved in the same way, it's highly likely that it's going to make the disease worse. It's going to make people more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. So I'm going to stop there. I'll just conclude my section. What I really want to convince you about is there's things in air pollution that really have damage throughout the body, and they can damage certainly the cardiovascular system in many different ways. And it could be that these tiny particles from vehicle exhaust are actually getting into the blood and going to areas of disease. And it's likely that particles in car exhaust are going to cause harm to the body if they behave in the same way. And actually this process that we call particle translocation, this could potentially account for all these other effects that I saw earlier. Could they cross the blood-brain barrier into the brain? Could they potentially cross into unborn babies? And that's something that's really an area that needs more research at the moment. I'm just going to try and end on just one positive note first of all, rather than being all doom and gloom. We have done other experiments that I haven't shown you where we have the diesel exhaust and we're exposing people to it. If you filter out the particles from the diesel exhaust and you look at the cardiovascular effects, you don't have them. Get rid of the particles, get rid of the cardiovascular effects. And that's good news because there's ways we can do this in the real world. The technology is out there. We have, for example, filters that we can put into the exhaust to filter particles out. We have cleaner fuels that make less particles. There's the electric revolution going on where we have electric cars which don't generate any particles at all in their vehicle exhaust. I should say that actually policies are very slow moving, but I genuinely believe that we are looking at policies in the right direction now where we're trying to reduce emissions from transport. And of course everyone can do their part, and there'll be a big push to try and encourage people to leave the car at home. So regular exercise, the benefits of regular exercise far outweigh any of the harmful effects of the air pollution that you're cycling in at the time. So we'll encourage people to get on their bike. I'll stop there. Let me just say thanks to everyone, all the people who do all the hard work here. I monopolised this slide by listing all of my colleagues. Tom does say thanks to everyone. He just can't remember their names, that's all. We've got to thank all our collaborators in this country and around the world, and of course all the volunteers and participants who are very good enough to get involved in our studies. And I should say we thank our funders, not just for the money that they give to do our research, but these research organisations really heavily promote the work and try to translate it into policy, and we're very grateful for that. And of course, thank you all for listening. I've been pumping diesel exhaust into this room for the last hour. You're still alive? I've not really. We'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions.